nun turned cook came west for work, then met a gruff mountain man next door. Sister Margaret stood in the quiet convent garden, the morning sun spilling softly over the neatly trimmed hedges and the small stone fountain at the center. She ran her fingers along the cool petals of a rose, thinking about the life she had lived for nearly 10 years. The convent had been her home, her shelter, and her whole world for a long time. She had joined when she was young, full of faith and a desire to help others. She had learned to pray in the quiet of the chapel, to cook and clean, to care for the sick and teach children. It was a life of discipline and routine, a life many would say was noble. Yet, over the years, she began to feel something stirring inside her, a quiet longing she could not name. She loved the convent, she truly did, but there was a part of her that wondered what the world beyond these walls might hold. Margaret walked slowly along the gravel path, thinking of the letters she had written and rewritten over the last few months. Leaving the convent was not an easy decision. It had taken countless prayers, long talks with the Mother Superior, and late nights of reflection to finally make up her mind. The sisters had been kind and supportive, though some were quietly saddened. Margaret could feel their eyes watching her sometimes, a mix of worry and curiosity. She understood. This was not a common choice, and not everyone could understand why a nun would leave the quiet life of prayer and service to step into the unknown. Her heart raced with both excitement and fear as she packed the small suitcase she had brought. She had chosen simple clothes suitable for traveling and working, nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. She wanted to blend in, to do her work, and to live simply. She also packed a few books, her journal, and a small wooden cross, a reminder of the faith that had shaped her. The convent had given her everything she needed to be prepared for the world, though she knew that the world beyond these walls was not as predictable as life inside them. The train ticket to the Western Mountains lay on the small desk beside her. She had chosen this destination carefully. The lodge in the mountains had advertised for a cook, someone reliable and willing to live in a remote area. Margaret liked the sound of that life, the peace of the mountains, the simplicity, the connection to nature, and the chance to serve people in a different way. It was a life that promised challenges, but also a sense of freedom she had never known before. She imagined waking up to the crisp air of the mountains, the smell of pine and snow, and the quiet hum of small-town life. It was a life far removed from the structured, predictable rhythm of the convent, and that both terrified and thrilled her. On the morning of her departure, the other sisters gathered quietly in the main hall. There were warm embraces, whispered blessings, and a few tears. Margaret felt a lump in her throat as she hugged each of them. "You are brave," said one sister, her voice trembling slightly. "Remember, wherever you go, you carry the heart of the convent with you." Margaret nodded, swallowing back her emotions. She knew she would miss them terribly, but she also knew that this step was something she had to take for herself, for her own growth and understanding. As she stepped onto the train platform, the whistle blew softly in the distance. She clutched her suitcase and her small cross, feeling the weight of her decision. The train itself was modest, but it smelled of polished wood and iron, and there was a quiet hum of conversation from the other travelers. Margaret found her seat near the window and gazed out as the countryside began to roll past. Fields of green, small villages, and winding rivers that reflected the morning sun. Each mile carried her further from the life she had known and closer to a future she could not yet see. During the journey, Margaret thought about what awaited her. She had experience in cooking, cleaning, and caring for people, but she had never lived alone or worked in such a remote location. There would be challenges, certainly. Winters would be harsh. Guests could be demanding. and she would have to learn quickly how to navigate life among strangers who had their own ways and expectations. Still, she felt a sense of determination growing inside her. This was her chance to live fully, to embrace the world with open eyes and an open heart. She resolved to face each challenge with patience, humility, and courage. The train rattled over bridges and through tunnels, carrying Margaret closer to her destination. She met a few travelers along the way, a family moving west for a new beginning, a man returning to his home in the mountains, and a young girl who reminded Margaret of the children she used to teach. They spoke politely, exchanged small smiles, and shared stories of their journeys. Margaret listened quietly, sometimes offering a few words of encouragement or advice. She realized that even in a world so different from the convent, her skills in listening, caring, and understanding people were just as valuable. As the train climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape began to change. Trees grew taller and denser, the air colder and fresher. Margaret watched the peaks rise majestically against the sky, their tops dusted with snow. Streams cut through the valleys below, sparkling in the sunlight. She felt a sense of awe and peace settle over her. This was a different kind of beauty than the quiet gardens of the convent. It was wild, untamed, and alive. Margaret felt a thrill at the thought of living here, working here, and being part of this landscape, even in a small way. When she finally arrived at the small mountain town, she stepped off the train with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The town was modest, with wooden cabins, a few shops, and a general store that served as the hub for the community. The lodge where she would work was a short walk from the station, a rustic building with smoke curling from the chimney and the scent of wood and pine in the air. Margaret took a deep breath and picked up her suitcase, feeling the weight of both her belongings and the new life that awaited her. The lodge owner, a cheerful woman named Clara, greeted Margaret warmly. "Welcome, we've been waiting for you," she said. Her handshake was firm and friendly, and Margaret felt an immediate sense of reassurance. Clara showed her to her small room above the kitchen, simple but cozy, with a window that looked out over the forest. "You'll find your work here fulfilling," Clara said. "Guests love home-cooked meals, and the mountains have a way of teaching patience and strength." Margaret nodded, feeling her excitement deepen. That evening, as she prepared her first meal in the lodge's modest kitchen, Margaret thought of the convent one last time. She remembered the quiet prayers, the lessons taught to children, the shared meals with the sisters, and she realized that all of that had prepared her for this moment. She could bring the same care, attention, and love to the meals she cooked here, to the people she met, and to the life she was building in this remote place. As she stirred a pot of soup and arranged vegetables for dinner, she felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that she had made the right choice, and that the world, vast and unknown, held possibilities she had only begun to imagine. Margaret went to bed that night feeling a mixture of fatigue and hope. The mountains were quiet except for the occasional howl of a distant coyote and the gentle rustle of trees in the wind. She could hear the lodge settling, the pipes sighing with warmth, and she felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, she felt the thrill of stepping into the unknown, of carving her own path, and of living a life that, though different from her past, was equally meaningful. The journey had just begun, and Margaret knew that the mountains, the lodge, and the people she would meet here would shape her in ways she could not yet see. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to dream of the life ahead, a life full of work, growth, and perhaps unexpected friendships that could change everything. The morning after her arrival, Margaret woke to the soft golden light spilling through the small window of her room. She could hear the faint sounds of the lodge waking up, the creak of doors, the quiet footsteps of early risers, and the hiss of coffee brewing in the kitchen below. Stretching, she felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. Today would be her first real day as the cook at the lodge, a role she had never held outside the quiet routines of the convent kitchen. She descended the narrow staircase carefully, her footsteps echoing lightly on the wooden steps. Clara, the lodge owner, was already in the kitchen, bustling with energy. "Good morning, Margaret," she called, cheerfully. "Breakfast is in an hour. Let's see what you can do." Margaret smiled politely and nodded, feeling the warmth of the kitchen and the steady rhythm of morning chores. The room was simple, with shelves lined with pots, pans, and jars of ingredients. Fresh vegetables were stacked neatly on the counter, and the smell of baked bread still lingered in the air. Margaret began by preparing a simple breakfast for the few guests who had stayed the night. She worked carefully, chopping vegetables, frying eggs, and setting plates with a gentle touch. She moved methodically, drawing on everything she had learned in the convent kitchen: attention to detail, patience, and care for the people she served. Soon the lodge filled with the aroma of sizzling food and fresh coffee. Guests emerged from their rooms, pleasantly surprised by the warmth and attention in the meals. While she worked, Margaret noticed movement through the trees outside the kitchen window. A man was walking along the dirt path that ran past the lodge. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the ease of someone used to hard work and solitude. His clothing was simple and worn, and his face, partially hidden by a thick beard, looked serious and weathered. Clara followed her gaze and chuckled softly. "That's Jedediah," she said. "Lives next door, all alone in his cabin. Don't let his gruff face fool you. He's part of this town. Just a little private." Margaret nodded, curious. She had heard stories from the other staff about the man next door. Some said he was difficult to get along with. Others said he was quietly kind once you earned his trust. Margaret found herself intrigued. There was something about the way he moved through the forest, calm yet purposeful, that reminded her of the strength and resilience she had admired in the sisters she had lived with. As the day went on, Margaret settled into a rhythm. She washed dishes, organized supplies, and cooked for the growing number of guests who arrived mid-morning. Her presence in the kitchen was quiet but steady, and slowly, the staff began to notice. One of the young kitchen helpers, a boy named Tommy, peeked into the pantry and asked, "You used to cook for lots of people, right?" Margaret smiled gently. "Yes," she replied. "I learned a long time ago how to feed many mouths with care and patience." Tommy nodded, impressed, and soon began assisting her, carrying pans and fetching ingredients. Later in the afternoon, Margaret stepped outside to gather fresh herbs from the small garden behind the lodge. The sun was warm on her face, and the air smelled of pine and earth. She carried a small basket, moving slowly among the plants, enjoying the simplicity of her work. It was then that she heard the low rumble of a voice coming from the path near the edge of the trees. "Need help with those?" the voice asked. Margaret looked up to see Jedediah standing there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He held a bundle of firewood under one arm, clearly on his way home but pausing to observe her. Margaret blinked, a little startled. "Oh, thank you, but I've got it," she said politely. She wasn't used to receiving attention in this way outside the convent, and she felt a small flutter of nervousness. Jedediah raised an eyebrow, studying her. "You're new here," he said simply. Margaret nodded. "Yes, I just arrived yesterday. I'm working in the lodge as a cook." His eyes flicked to the basket of herbs she carried. "I can help with that. Easier to carry in 2 trips. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then agreed. She handed him the basket, surprised at how quickly he moved, strong and sure with each step. Together they carried the herbs to the kitchen, moving in silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel and the rustling of leaves. Inside the kitchen, Margaret set the herbs down and thanked him. "I appreciate it," she said. Jedediah nodded, as if acknowledging her thanks was sufficient. He turned to leave, but then paused. "You cook well?" he asked, his tone blunt but not unkind. Margaret smiled. "I do my best," she replied. "Cooking has always been about care and attention for me." Jedediah grunted softly, a sound she could not quite read, and then left the kitchen, closing the door behind him. Margaret felt a strange mix of curiosity and amusement. There was something about him, rough, private, and yet interesting. Over the next few days, Margaret noticed Jedediah often. He walked past the lodge each morning, sometimes stopping to check the woodpile, other times just watching the forest around him. Margaret began to anticipate these encounters, finding herself curious about his life and his work. She noticed that he was careful with the environment, respectful of the animals, and skilled at moving through the woods. She admired his self-sufficiency and strength, qualities so different from the quiet, sheltered life she had known. One afternoon, a small problem arose in the kitchen. A pipe under the sink had sprung a leak, and water was beginning to pool on the floor. Margaret had tried to fix it herself, but quickly realized she needed help. Remembering Jedediah, she hesitated, unsure if she should ask. After a moment, she stepped outside and called politely, "Excuse me, Jedediah?" He appeared almost immediately, holding a tool in one hand and an expression that said he had been expecting some request. Margaret explained the problem, and without a word he knelt by the sink, working quickly and efficiently to repair the pipe. Margaret watched, impressed by his skill and quiet confidence. When he finished, she thanked him again. He shrugged, brushing off the praise. "Just a small job," he said. Margaret smiled, realizing that despite his gruff manner, he was willing to help. There was a sense of reliability about him, a promise that even if he seemed rough, he could be counted on when it mattered. This realization surprised her. She had expected to feel distant, perhaps intimidated, but instead she felt a quiet sense of connection, small as it was. As the week went on, Margaret continued to learn the rhythms of the lodge and the town. She greeted guests, cooked meals, and tidied the rooms with careful attention. Each day she saw Jedediah, sometimes in fleeting moments, a shadow moving across the forest edge, a brief exchange of words, or a silent nod from the window. Slowly, their interactions grew more comfortable. Margaret learned to speak plainly and confidently, and Jedediah, while still reserved, seemed to respect her presence and her efforts. By the end of her first week, Margaret felt a sense of accomplishment. The lodge was running smoothly, the guests were satisfied, and she had begun to find her place in the rhythm of this new life. The mountains were beautiful and challenging, the work demanding, but she felt alive in a way she never had before. And Jedediah, with his quiet strength and unexpected kindness, had become a familiar presence, a reminder that even in a new and unfamiliar place, connections could be formed in small but meaningful ways. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret sat by her window with a cup of tea. She thought about the past week, the journey from the convent, her first days in the lodge, the guests she had met, and the gruff man next door who had become an unexpected ally. She realized that this life, full of work, discovery, and human connection, was teaching her something valuable. It was teaching her to trust, to adapt, and to see the world not just as a place to live, but as a place to grow and belong. Margaret smiled softly, feeling the promise of the days ahead. The mountains were vast, the lodge humble, and the people new, but she was ready to face it all with patience, kindness, and courage. And as she sipped her tea, she knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life in ways she could not yet imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret began to feel more at home in the mountains. The lodge had settled into a rhythm, with her as a quiet, dependable presence in the kitchen. She enjoyed the work, the chopping of vegetables, the warmth of the stove, and the satisfaction of seeing guests enjoy her meals. Each task reminded her of the simple lessons from the convent: care, patience, and attention to detail. The mountains were harsh at times, with cold winds and sudden rain, but she found comfort in routine, in the sense of purpose that came from doing her work well. Jedediah, the man next door, continued to be a familiar presence. Margaret often saw him from the kitchen window, walking along the forest path or tending to his small cabin. Sometimes he would nod or wave, a brief acknowledgement of her presence. Other times he would simply pass by, focused on his own work. Margaret found herself curious about him. He was private, certainly, but there was an honesty in the way he moved, a strength and self-reliance she had rarely seen before. One afternoon, while she was carrying a basket of fresh bread to the guests' dining area, she noticed Jedediah struggling with a broken fence post near his cabin. The wood had split, and the fence leaned awkwardly, threatening to fall. Margaret paused for a moment, considering whether she should offer help. She had little experience with tools beyond the occasional repairs in the convent, but she also remembered the small lessons of kindness and assistance she had always been taught. She stepped toward the path, calling gently, "Jedediah, do you need a hand?" He looked up, surprised, his brow furrowed. "I've got it," he said gruffly, though there was no harshness in his tone. Margaret smiled softly. "Sometimes an extra pair of hands makes things easier," she said. Jedediah considered her for a moment, then sighed and nodded. "All right," he said simply. "Come on, then." Together they worked on the fence. Margaret passed nails and held boards steady, while Jedediah hammered and measured. The air was filled with the sound of clinking metal, snapping wood, and the occasional laughter as a board slipped or a nail bent. Margaret found herself enjoying the work more than she had expected. There was something satisfying about physical effort, about creating something sturdy and lasting with her own hands. Jedediah, too, seemed to soften as they worked side by side. He explained his methods with quiet patience, and Margaret listened carefully, asking questions when she did not understand. By the time the fence was repaired, both were tired but satisfied. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, smiling at the sturdy line of wood that now held firm. Jedediah gave a small nod of approval. "Not bad," he said simply. "Better than I expected." Margaret laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She realized that this was the beginning of a slow friendship, built not on words but on shared effort and mutual respect. Over the next few days, their interactions became more frequent. Jedediah would sometimes stop by the lodge to ask about tools or share a small piece of news about the area. Margaret began to speak more openly with him, telling small stories about her life in the convent, the children she had taught, and the work she had done for the community. Jedediah listened quietly, occasionally asking questions. Margaret noticed a spark of interest in his eyes, a curiosity that seemed genuine. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, and heavy rain began to fall, followed by strong gusts of wind. The lodge's roof creaked under the weight of the storm, and Margaret quickly moved to help secure the windows and prepare a warm meal for the guests. Jedediah appeared at the door, carrying a lantern. "Looks like it's going to be a long night," he said, his voice calm despite the wind. Margaret nodded, grateful for his presence. "Yes," she said, "but It's easier to handle when we work together. During the storm, they worked side by side, checking on the animals, delivering meals to the guests, and making sure everyone was safe and comfortable. Margaret was impressed by Jedediah's quiet competence. He moved through the lodge and surrounding area with ease, his knowledge of the land and weather evident in every action. Margaret in turn found herself relying on her own skills and instincts, feeling a sense of accomplishment in contributing to the safety and comfort of those around her. When the storm finally passed, the lodge settled into quiet again. The wind still rattled the windows, but the rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Margaret and Jedediah sat briefly on the porch, catching their breath and watching the clouds drift away. There was a comfortable silence between them, one that spoke of trust and shared experience. Margaret felt a small thrill, an understanding that this man, so different from anyone she had ever known, could become a friend. In the days that followed, their friendship grew in subtle ways. Margaret would leave small baskets of fresh bread or herbs near the edge of Jedediah's property, and he would sometimes leave notes or small gifts in return. An extra log for her stove, a handful of berries, or a simple carving made from wood. Each gesture was small, but it built a quiet connection, a sense that they could rely on each other despite the differences in their lives. One afternoon, Margaret noticed Jedediah struggling to repair a broken wheel on his small cart. She approached him carefully, offering her assistance. He looked at her, hesitated, and then nodded. Together, they lifted the cart, adjusted the wheel, and secured it in place. During the work, Jedediah spoke more openly, sharing stories of his life in the mountains, how he had learned to hunt, fish, and live independently. Margaret listened intently, fascinated by his knowledge and the strength it had taken to live so self-sufficiently. Margaret began to understand that Jedediah's gruffness was not unkindness, but a form of caution and self-protection. He had lived a life of solitude, facing the challenges of the mountains on his own. Yet beneath that tough exterior was a man capable of thoughtfulness, patience, and even humor. Margaret found herself laughing at his dry jokes and appreciating his practical wisdom. In turn, she shared more of her own experiences, telling him stories of the convent, of teaching children, and of the small joys of helping others. Jedediah listened, sometimes quietly, sometimes asking questions, and Margaret realized that she was beginning to trust him in a way she had not expected. By the end of the month, the two had developed a rhythm of friendship. They met during small moments, passing on the trail, working together on chores, or sharing a meal on the porch of the lodge. Their conversations were simple, often practical, but each carried an unspoken understanding. Margaret felt a sense of comfort in his presence, a reassurance that even in this remote, unfamiliar place, she could form meaningful connections. Jedediah, for his part, seemed to appreciate her steady, thoughtful nature, and the way she approached life with patience and care. Margaret reflected on the changes she had experienced since arriving in the mountains. She had left the convent seeking something unknown, and though the work was challenging, it had brought her a sense of fulfillment she had never imagined. She had learned to navigate the rhythms of the lodge, to manage her own fears and doubts, and to form bonds with people who were entirely different from those she had known before. Most importantly, she had begun to see that trust and friendship could grow slowly, quietly, in small gestures and shared experiences. One evening, as the sun set over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Margaret stood on the porch of the lodge. She watched the forest below, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. Jedediah appeared on the path, carrying a small bundle of firewood. He paused, nodded at her, and walked toward his cabin. Margaret smiled softly, feeling the warmth of their growing connection. She knew that life in the mountains was not easy, but she also knew that it was full of possibilities, friendship, learning, and the quiet joys of living fully in the moment. Margaret returned inside, her heart light and hopeful. The mountains stretched around her, vast and untamed, and she felt ready to face whatever challenges and adventures awaited. With Jedediah as a new friend, someone who understood the land and the value of hard work, she realized that she was no longer entirely alone. Life in the mountains was teaching her patience, resilience, and the quiet power of connection. She knew that her journey had only just begun, and she welcomed it with open arms and an open heart. Winter had settled into the mountains, blanketing the forest and lodge in a thick layer of snow. The air was sharp and cold, and the wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden shutters of the lodge. Margaret awoke one morning to find the world outside transformed. White, still, and beautiful, but also demanding and unforgiving. She dressed warmly, layering her clothes against the cold, and went downstairs to start breakfast. The lodge was quiet except for the faint creak of the old floors and the hiss of the stove heating the kitchen. The guests had been warned about the coming snowstorm, but some had still arrived, eager to see the mountains in winter. Margaret moved efficiently, preparing hot meals of porridge, bread, and stew. Each plate she set down was made with care, knowing that warm food was a comfort in the biting cold. The staff hustled to make sure everyone was safe, and Margaret felt a mix of satisfaction and concern. Winter in the mountains could be dangerous, and she knew they would have to work together to get through it safely. The storm began in the late morning. Snow fell heavily, covering the paths and making travel impossible. The wind tore at the trees, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as the world outside disappeared into a white blur. She knew that the roads would soon be blocked, and anyone venturing out would be at risk. She set her jaw and decided that everyone in the lodge needed to be prepared. Extra firewood, warm blankets, and enough food to last several days. It was then that Jedediah appeared at the lodge door, carrying a lantern in one hand and a stack of firewood in the other. He shook the snow from his coat and offered a small, brief nod to Margaret. "Storm's coming," he said simply. "Better be ready." Margaret felt a wave of relief. His presence was reassuring, a reminder that she was not alone in facing the harshness of the mountains. Together, they worked to move firewood inside, secure the windows, and check that all the guests were safe and comfortable. The day passed in a flurry of activity. Margaret cooked continuously, keeping the guests fed and warm. Jedediah moved around the lodge, helping wherever needed, lifting heavy items, clearing snow from paths, and repairing minor damages caused by the wind. Margaret watched him in admiration. His strength and knowledge of the mountains were remarkable. He seemed to anticipate problems before they happened, moving with a quiet efficiency that kept everyone safe. Margaret realized that she had underestimated him. Beneath the gruff exterior was a man who cared deeply for the people and the place he called home. That evening, the storm grew stronger. The wind rattled the windows, and the snow piled against the lodge walls. Some of the guests were nervous, and Margaret did her best to reassure them with a warm smile and steady presence. She served hot soup and tea, sitting with those who were frightened and offering words of comfort. Jedediah moved silently among them as well, speaking little but acting decisively when help was needed. Margaret noticed that the guests began to rely on him almost as much as they relied on her. His presence was solid, dependable, and calming. Late that night, after the lodge had settled, Margaret found a moment to rest. She sat by the small fire in the lounge, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Jedediah appeared shortly after, standing in the doorway with a quiet question. "You need help upstairs?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, I think everything is in order." "Thank you." He nodded and remained nearby, his presence a silent support. They shared a small, quiet conversation about the storm, the lodge, and the surrounding mountains. Margaret felt a sense of comfort in their companionship. It was unspoken, but she knew that they had become a team. Over the next few days, the storm continued, cutting off travel and isolating the lodge from the outside world. Margaret and Jedediah worked together tirelessly. She cooked, organized supplies, and ensured that everyone had enough to eat and stay warm. He helped with repairs, cleared snow, and even guided a few guests who had braved the paths back to the lodge when they realized the storm was too strong. They learned to communicate without words at times, anticipating each other's needs and moving in harmony. Margaret began to see the depth of Jedediah's character. His loyalty, resilience, and sense of responsibility were as strong as the mountains themselves. One morning, a small crisis arose. A tree had fallen near the edge of the lodge property, blocking a secondary path and threatening the small animal pens nearby. Margaret felt a pang of worry, but Jedediah took charge immediately. "We can move it," he said, his tone calm. Margaret grabbed an axe and a rope, and together they cleared the path. The work was exhausting, and the cold seeped into their bones, but the sense of accomplishment when the path was clear was immense. Margaret realized that facing challenges together built trust in ways words never could. She admired his ability to stay calm under pressure, and felt proud of herself for keeping up with him. During one quiet moment after the work was done, Margaret and Jedediah sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm tea. The storm had softened slightly, leaving a blanket of fresh snow glistening in the morning light. They spoke quietly about their pasts, the choices they had made, the lessons they had learned, and the ways life had shaped them. Margaret shared stories from the convent, of teaching children, helping the sick, and finding joy in small acts of kindness. Jedediah spoke of living in the mountains, learning to survive, and finding peace in solitude. Margaret listened intently, fascinated by the contrast and yet similarity in their experiences. It was during these shared moments that Margaret realized something important. Despite their very different lives, they had both learned to rely on patience, strength, and compassion. They had both faced challenges, and both had found ways to help others. The storm, which had at first seemed like a trial, had become a bridge between them, a way to understand each other more deeply. Margaret felt a quiet warmth, a sense of connection that went beyond words or gestures. She knew that they were forming a bond that would last, built on respect, trust, and shared experiences. By the end of the storm, the lodge was safe, the guests were comfortable, and life slowly returned to normal. Margaret and Jedediah continued to work together, now with a deeper understanding of each other's strengths and capabilities. They laughed over small mistakes in the kitchen, shared tips for surviving the cold, and sometimes just enjoyed the quiet of the mountains together. Margaret felt a growing sense of belonging. She had come to the mountains seeking a new life, and in Jedediah, she had found not only a friend, but someone who understood the challenges and rewards of living in this remote, beautiful place. As winter began to ease and the first hints of spring appeared, Margaret reflected on all that had happened. The storm had tested them, showing the strength of their partnership and the value of trust. She had discovered qualities in herself she had not known: resilience, courage, and the ability to adapt to difficult situations. Jedediah, too, had shown her a side of himself that was patient, thoughtful, and loyal. Margaret realized that life in the mountains was not just about survival, but about connection, growth, and learning to appreciate the small moments of joy and accomplishment. One evening, as the sun set over the snow-covered peaks, Margaret and Jedediah stood side by side, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. They had spent the day checking the lodge, delivering food to a few remaining guests, and repairing minor damage caused by melting snow. Margaret smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction and peace. She had come to the mountains seeking a new life, and she had found it, not just in the work she did, but in the bond she had formed with Jedediah, in the trust they had built, and in the quiet joy of facing challenges together. Margaret returned to the lodge that evening with a heart full of gratitude. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. She understood now that life was unpredictable, sometimes harsh, but also full of opportunities for connection and growth. With Jedediah by her side, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they could face them together. She went to bed feeling a deep sense of contentment, ready for the next chapter of her life in the mountains, strengthened by experience, friendship, and the quiet power of trust. Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting the last of the winter snow and revealing the fresh green of the forest floor. The lodge began to fill with the cheerful sounds of birds, trickling streams, and the laughter of guests exploring the trails. Margaret woke early, as usual, feeling a quiet joy in the changing season. The lodge now felt like home, each corner familiar, each routine comforting. She had grown into her role as the cook, her presence in the kitchen steady and reliable, yet warm and welcoming. Guests often complimented the meals, remarking on the thoughtfulness and care she put into every dish. Margaret smiled at each compliment, quietly proud of the work she had accomplished since arriving in the mountains. Jedediah remained a constant part of her days. Though he was still reserved, they had developed a rhythm of companionship. Their friendship had grown slowly, rooted in shared experiences, mutual respect, and an understanding that neither of them needed words to know they could rely on one another. Sometimes he would help in small ways, bringing firewood, checking fences, or offering advice on the forest trails. Other times he would simply appear nearby, his presence quiet but comforting, a reminder that she was not alone in this remote and often demanding place. One bright morning, Margaret decided to take a walk along the forest trail behind the lodge. She carried a small basket, intending to gather herbs for the evening meal. The sun filtered through the trees, and the air smelled of damp earth and fresh growth. She moved slowly, enjoying the peacefulness, when she heard the sound of someone moving through the underbrush. Jedediah appeared from the trees, carrying a small bundle of firewood and wearing a slight smile. "Good morning," he said simply. "Ah, thought you could use some company." Margaret felt a warm surge of happiness. She nodded, glad for the familiar companionship. "Good morning," she replied. "I'd like that." As they walked together, they spoke quietly, sharing observations about the forest and the lodge. Jedediah pointed out a patch of wildflowers that would bloom soon and told her which herbs were best for cooking. Margaret listened attentively, occasionally asking questions about the forest and the wildlife. She found herself learning from him in ways that went beyond practical knowledge. He had a way of seeing the mountains that was patient, thoughtful, and full of quiet appreciation. Margaret realized that she had come to value not just his help, but his perspective, his ability to notice the small details that others might overlook. Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened. Margaret discovered that she enjoyed having someone to share the small joys of life with. The smell of fresh bread baking, the laughter of children on the trails, or the way sunlight danced through the trees. Jedediah, in turn, seemed to appreciate her company more than he had expected. He would pause to share a story from his past or offer advice on the lodge or the surrounding land. Margaret listened, fascinated by his experiences and the way he had learned to survive and thrive in the mountains. There was a quiet respect between them, an understanding that each had something to offer the other. One day, a minor emergency arose at the lodge. A guest had injured their ankle while hiking and needed assistance to get back safely. Bo, 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 bo. Margaret immediately prepared a small first aid kit and warm drinks while Jedediah guided them along the safest path back to the lodge. Together, they worked calmly and efficiently, ensuring the guests' comfort and safety. Margaret was impressed by Jedediah's skill and patience. He moved steadily, carefully, and with a quiet authority that reassured everyone. Margaret realized that the trust between them had grown so strong that they could act without hesitation, anticipating each other's needs without a word. After the guest was safely returned, Margaret and Jedediah sat on the lodge porch for a brief moment of rest. The sky was clear, and the mountains glowed in the late afternoon light. They spoke softly, reflecting on the winter months, the storms, and the challenges they had faced together. Margaret felt a sense of gratitude for everything she had experienced, the growth, the lessons, and the deepening friendship she had found in this rugged place. Jedediah listened, his expression thoughtful, and Margaret noticed a softness in his eyes that she had not seen before. As the season progressed, Margaret continued to grow into her life in the mountains. She had become a part of the local community, known for her kindness, skill, and steady presence. Guests and neighbors alike appreciated her warmth and dedication. Yet she knew that her life had been enriched not only by the work she did, but also by the companionship she had found in Jedediah. Their friendship had become a steady, quiet force in her life, a reminder that connection and trust could flourish even in the most unexpected places. One afternoon, Margaret was preparing a small picnic for the lodge guests who were venturing out on the trails to enjoy the spring sunshine. Jedediah appeared, carrying a basket of fresh eggs and a bundle of herbs. "Ah, thought you might like some help," he said, his voice low but steady. Margaret smiled, accepting his offer gratefully. Together they set up a small table with food and drinks, enjoying the simple pleasure of working side by side. As they arranged the meal, they shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of understanding. Margaret felt a sense of ease she had rarely known, a comfort in the presence of someone who saw her, respected her, and cared in subtle but meaningful ways. That evening, after the guests had returned and the lodge had settled, Margaret and Jedediah sat by the fireplace, sipping warm tea. The glow of the fire illuminated the room, casting a soft light over their faces. They spoke about the future, their plans, and the possibilities that lay ahead. Margaret realized that she no longer feared the unknown. The mountains, the lodge, and the people around her had taught her resilience, patience, and the value of forming bonds with those who shared her values and respect for life. Jedediah listened, occasionally nodding, offering quiet observations, and Margaret felt a deep sense of connection. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret began to see that her life in the mountains was not just a new chapter. It was a transformation. She had left the convent seeking something unknown, and in this remote, beautiful place, she had found purpose, friendship, and a sense of belonging. Jedediah, once a gruff and private man, had become her companion in both work and thought. Their bond had grown slowly, built on shared experiences, challenges, and the quiet understanding that comes from facing life together. Margaret realized that this was what she had been searching for, not just adventure or freedom, but a connection that was steady, meaningful, and real. One morning, as the sun rose over the peaks and painted the sky with soft pinks and golds, Margaret walked along the forest trail with Jedediah. They collected wildflowers for the lodge and spoke about the changes in the landscape, the growth of the forest, and the promise of summer. Margaret felt a deep sense of joy in these moments, a feeling of belonging that went beyond the lodge or her work. She had discovered that life was not just about completing tasks or following routines. It was about forming connections, learning from others, and embracing the beauty and challenges of the world around her. As they returned to the lodge, Margaret felt a quiet sense of contentment. She had grown in confidence, skill, and understanding. She had learned to trust herself and others, to face challenges with courage, and to appreciate the small moments of beauty and joy that life offered. And most of all, she had discovered the value of friendship, of someone who could share both work and silence, laughter and reflection. Jedediah had become more than a neighbor. He was a companion, a teacher, and a steady presence in her life. That evening, Margaret sat by her window, watching the mountains glow in the last light of day. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the quiet convent, through the long train ride, and into this remote, beautiful place where she had learned to live fully and connect deeply. She felt a sense of gratitude for every challenge, every storm, and every moment of companionship that had shaped her experience. Margaret smiled softly, knowing that life in the mountains had given her more than she could have imagined. It had given her purpose, growth, and a friendship that would last. As the stars appeared one by one in the clear night sky, Margaret felt a quiet peace. She was no longer just a newcomer to the mountains. She was part of this land, this lodge, and this life. And with Jedediah by her side, she knew that the days ahead would be full of discovery, laughter, and the simple joys of living in a place that was challenging, beautiful, and alive. Margaret closed her eyes, content in the knowledge that she had found a home, not just in the mountains, but in the quiet strength of friendship and the shared journey of life.